Alyssa Porter stepped forward with a single question that split the space between her and Derek Porter, and his answer landed with a casualness that felt like a shove. She had brought selections home with careful intent and had explained their purpose clearly, leaving no room for confusion, and she believed Derek heard her the way she meant to be heard. He had asked about sharing them more than once, and each time Alyssa had answered without hesitation, stating the boundary with a precision that left nothing ambiguous. She had chosen those selections with deliberate attention, thinking about them as a small reserve of meaning to share privately, and she protected that plan with direct language. Derek listened then. He acknowledged then. Her expectation rested on that confirmation. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. Derek's reply to her question was offered with an ease Alyssa could not reconcile with what he had heard before. He described how he had moved those selections into other hands. Alyssa registered the words as if someone else had spoken them, because every conversation she remembered contradicted the possibility that he would do so without permission. She had tested the clarity of her requests again and again, reducing each exchange to a single repeated instruction she assumed would be impossible to mishear. Each request Derek made to pass the selections along had met the same firm refusal. Each refusal had been plain and precise. That repetition had built her confidence in the boundary. Instead, she faced his confessed disregard. His tone modeled normalcy. He described his action without the hesitance a person might show after misplacing something important. He framed the choice as insignificant. He suggested he had not noticed the relevance she attached to what she brought home. He presented her reaction as an overreach. Alyssa tried to align his account with the memory of her clear refusals, but the two accounts refused alignment. He had asked permission. She had refused. He had removed the subject from her control. That simple arithmetic did not compute into an explanation of forgetfulness. Alyssa replayed the path from selection to conversation in her mind, pausing on each point where she had made her boundary explicit. She imagined offering the items to Derek, describing the reason she had chosen them, and expecting him to honor the meaning she assigned. She had worried at times about potential social moments where others might be offered what she had set aside, so she had prepared a separate accommodation to avoid any misunderstanding. Derek accepted that accommodation. That fact made his later admission impossible to reconcile with the comprehension he had shown earlier. Offering an alternative had been intended to prevent precisely this outcome. His movement beyond that safeguard signaled disregard. He presented his forgetfulness as plausible. He suggested the matter had slipped memory. Alyssa recognized the words and the frame of argument he used to shrink the event, but the logic faltered in her ears. Asking to pass something along and being offered an alternative do not align with true forgetfulness. They align with awareness. Derek's repeated queries had implied he understood the boundary enough to test it, and testing followed by unilateral action suggested intention rather than accident. That distinction expanded the moment into a confrontation about respect rather than a misplaced lapse. As Derek continued to explain, he shifted the focus from his choice to her response. He urged that she not escalate the matter, recommended guidance to process the intensity of her reaction, suggested that reconciliation mattered more than the loss she described. The reframing placed the responsibility to resolve the situation on her shoulders instead of on the action that created the need for resolution. Alyssa felt that redirection as a pressure to accommodate his explanation, instead of receiving accountability for the act he admitted. It transformed the exchange into a question of whose feelings would be carried forward rather than what behavior required repair. Alyssa examined the series of small decisions that mapped the path to the current rupture. She thought of the deliberate way she selected the items that mattered to her, the care she took to preserve their meaning, and the conversations she had held, so neither would cross the threshold into the hands of others. She believed those conversations had anchored a mutual understanding. She believed Derek had heard the constraint. His decision to move beyond that constraint now stood as an action that redefined how words functioned between them. Language had been, in her view, a mechanism for mutual choice. Derek's conduct redefined it as optional. He offered explanations that sought to normalize the outcome. He spoke of small missteps, of memory lapses, of the ease of social moments where things moved through hands without strict oversight. Each explanation required her to accept his version of the event, rather than demand recognition of what she had explicitly asked for. Alyssa felt the logic of his words thin under the weight of their prior conversations, and the thinness revealed a willingness to prioritize convenience over the mutual agreement they had formed. The central problem narrowed in her consciousness. Respect for a clearly articulated limit had eroded. The items in question mattered because they represented a deliberate choice she had made for their shared life, and honoring that choice had been the point of her repeated directives. Derek's action suggested that boundaries she set were negotiable in practice. The choice to hand them outward without consultation conveyed a hierarchy where his discretion could override her explicit refusal. That hierarchy contradicted the assumption of shared authority she had relied on. Alyssa considered the dynamics that allowed such a choice to be made without consultation. She thought about the number of times Derek requested permission and how she had answered, how she had tried to avoid conflict through plain language and practical alternatives, and how those measures had been insufficient. Her attempts at compromise had been meant to prevent the very outcome they now faced. Instead, the compromise had been bypassed. The bypassing felt less like a slip and more like a deliberate prioritization of his social preferences over her clearly stated limit. The exchange became a test of how their partnership would handle boundaries moving forward. Derek's framing of the issue as insignificant demanded that she reduce the significance she attached to his choice. The demand placed her in the role of reconciling the fracture while he preserved his own interpretation of events as minor. He recommended resources for navigating the emotional fallout, positioning the next step as something she should pursue to moderate her perspective. The suggestion functioned in practice as a way of depoliticizing the moment and shifting responsibility away from the decision he had made. Alyssa watched how effortlessly he reframed the problem and felt a growing urgency to ensure the account of events matched the reality she had lived through. She understood that the items themselves were less important than what his choice revealed about how their decisions would be negotiated. The material absence was a symptom. The deeper issue was a pattern of how her expressed priorities would be weighed against his inclinations. The pattern, as she now perceived it, indicated that her voice might be subordinate when their preferences diverged. She measured potential responses in her mind. She could insist on direct acknowledgement of the decision and a clear expression of why it had occurred without consent. She could demand a process for handling shared decisions going forward, one that protected expressed boundaries from unilateral overrides. She could accept reconciliation while acknowledging the disparity between his explanation and the sequence of events. Any path forward required clarity, either mutual respect for voiced limits or acceptance that voiced limits could be overturned. Alyssa realized the choice before her would set the terms for how similar conflicts would be resolved in the future. Derek continued to speak as if normalcy could be re-established through reassurance and minimal concession. He sought to move the conversation from transgression to repair without establishing the basis for genuine repair. The movement suggested a preference for smoothing over the consequences, rather than addressing their cause. Alyssa found the approach unacceptable. Repair without accountability would leave the mechanism that produced the violation intact. It would allow the pattern to repeat under the cover of conciliatory language. She felt a quiet resolve assemble beneath the shock. The resolve did not arrive as heat, but as clarity. The boundary had functioned as a test of mutual regard, and the outcome revealed the relative weight of their voices. Derek's casual acceptance of the act and his insistence. She moderate her response provided the very evidence she needed to understand the place her requests occupied in his decision-making. With that clarity came the need for an action that matched the significance of the revelation. Alyssa weighed the labor of insisting upon reckoning against the cost of ignoring what had been revealed. She knew the work of restoring balance required explicit recognition and a willingness to adjust choices that harmed trust. She recognized that asking for that recognition would demand emotional labor. She did not want to shoulder alone, particularly when Derek's framing suggested she should absorb the burden externally. The choice to pursue repair thus depended not only on his willingness to accept responsibility, but also on her readiness to insist upon consequences that would alter future behavior. Derek's final attempts at conciliation urged her to step back, to avoid letting the moment reshape their bond, and to consider outside help as a route to perspective. The proposal felt to Alyssa like a soft attempt to relocate responsibility away from the action and onto her internal processing. It left the original decision unexamined and preserved the conditions that made it possible. She found the approach inadequate given the clarity of the violation. She found herself confronting a fundamental question about authority and mutual regard in their life together. If expressed boundaries could be superseded by unilateral action, then the mechanisms meant to protect consent and mutual understanding were compromised. The incident shifted from a discrete grievance into a lens revealing the structural choices they would face in future disagreements. Alyssa felt the weight of that realization settle into a steady, unyielding place inside her. Her response needed to match the scale of the revelation, not merely the material absence. She would not be satisfied with minimization or with guidance that placed the burden of repair solely on her. She required acknowledgement of the choice he made and a concrete commitment to adjusting how shared decisions were honored. The clarity she had gained demanded change, not placation. Alyssa stood in the space the decision had created, holding the clarity like a tool to shape what came next. The conversation had revealed not merely an error, but an orientation toward choices that privileged convenience over consent. That orientation could not be smoothed away with mild reassurances. It required a redefinition of how their partnership would respect voiced limits. The path forward, she understood, would hinge on whether Derek recognized the gravity of what he had done and whether he was willing to alter behavior that showed those limits as negotiable. The matter had become, in her eyes, not reducible to reconciliation without consequence. It required reckoning, and she now had the clarity to demand it. Ethan Walker stepped into a listing, and the promise felt like a thin veneer about to crack. Every presentation designed to reassure instead amplified a single question in his mind: who would pay for the damage no one had fixed? Ethan had imagined ownership as control and shelter, a path to stability, and he approached each option with that intention. The listing spoke of affordability and potential while focusing attention on appearance, but Ethan trained his eyes on the systems that determined habitability. Paint and flooring offered immediate polish, but the things that could not be painted were what mattered most. He examined seams at the roofline and panels that suggested long service. He traced piping where mineral lines and stress marks argued against longevity, and he noted mechanical elements that cycled with weary effort. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. Mark Dalton presented numbers with ease, translating accumulated value into tidy selling points while steering conversation away from records and replacements. Mark emphasized appreciation and potential resale rather than maintenance histories, and his language smoothed over the responsibilities left unresolved. Ethan demanded documentation, service records, contractor invoices, and permits that would verify major work. Responses were framed in generalities and euphemism, with mentions of occasional fixes but no substantiation. The absence of paperwork revealed as much as any visible defect. Neglect had been deferred rather than addressed. Ethan ran the arithmetic in his head and watched the listing prices shift, meaning when he added the cost of imminent replacement for roofs and systems and the likelihood of sudden plumbing failure. The glossy presentation dissolved into a ledger of immediate obligations. Sellers defended cosmetic investment as a rational choice, arguing that selective upgrades improved sale prospects while full structural work could wait. That logic created a transfer of burden, gains secured by postponing repair, and obligations passed to the next owner. Ethan recognized the pattern as a structural feature rather than a series of isolated lapses. He started insisting on independent inspections that quantified remaining life on key systems and on contractor estimates that specified replacement costs. Mark pushed back softly, invoking urgency and the emotional pull of ownership, but Ethan treated urgency as a tactic to limit scrutiny. He requested escrow arrangements to hold funds until confirmed work was completed and contractual clauses that assigned responsibility for undisclosed failures. Those demands were practical measures intended to align risk with responsibility. Mark offered assurances instead of binding commitments, framing contingencies as unlikely and repairs as manageable. Ethan considered the lived consequences of accepting a deal without verified safeguards, sudden failures that required direct capital, schedules disrupted by emergency work, and repeated unplanned expense that eroded options. He pictured a sequence of repairs that would consume both time and savings, and realized that such demands would not be occasional annoyances, but recurring drains. The arithmetic no longer supported the narrative of investment. It pointed to absorption of deferred cost. Ethan rejected the normalization of deferred maintenance as a buyer's burden. He tested the seller's claims by tracing material clues, discoloration where water had altered surfaces, patched seams that suggested prior leaks, and temporary fixes applied rather than systems replaced. Those signs increased the probability of urgent demand and removed the comfort of gradual repair. Mark continued to highlight market momentum, citing comparable properties to frame these offers as sensible, but Ethan saw comparison as misleading when the underlying systems were not comparable. Price parity did not equal functional parity. Ethan began to see the broader mechanics. Owners had capitalized on appreciation while deferring care, preserving profit by postponing expense. The market rewarded those who avoided long-term investment, and the result transferred hidden liability to buyers lacking reserves. Ethan considered alternatives. Renting suddenly appeared as a rational choice that preserved predictability and responsibility allocation. A failing boiler would be the landlord's burden rather than an emergency on his balance sheet. Mark framed renting as forfeiting equity, but Ethan reframed equity that was illiquid or directly consumed by emergency repairs as meaningless in practice. The choice became a question of allocation: accept symbolic advancement at the cost of bearing other people's unresolved obligations, or retain flexibility and avoid being the default remedy for deferred work. Ethan formalized his position. He insisted on binding proof of major work, escrowed funds covering confirmed replacement, and contractual guarantees that protected him if undisclosed failures emerged. Those measures were straightforward but cut into the ease with which sellers excited. Mark's tone shifted. Professional polish thinned at the edges when the routine of quick transactions met insistence for accountability. Sellers offered partial concessions, small reductions in price, or promises to address a subset of items before transfer, but the largest liabilities remained unresolved in most offers. Ethan refused informal commitments lacking escrow or verified contracts. He would not agree to accept open-ended exposure simply because the listing photo looked updated. The negotiation hardened into a test of who would finally internalize cost. If sellers accepted obligations proportionate to deferred maintenance, deals could proceed on fairer terms. If not, Ethan would walk away. Mark attempted a narrower compromise, proposing limited escrow for certain items while leaving major systems unprotected, and Ethan declined. He required comprehensive alignment between price, documented condition, and remedies for hidden failure. The refusal was principled rather than obstinate. Ethan would not underwrite someone else's postponement. As exchanges failed, patterns crystallized in his mind. This was not occasional neglect, but a system that converted deferred upkeep into buyer exposure. Owners reaped appreciation while avoiding reinvestment. The market allowed profit without accountability. Ethan saw the inequity clearly. Buyers without access to reserves were more likely to accept risky bargains and to bear the consequences of sudden failure. He chose not to be one of them. Repeated encounters revealed how staged presentation obscured mechanical reality. Staged lighting and fresh color deepened impression, while the roof seam, the aged coil, and the mineral build up at a junction signaled impending demand. Ethan cataloged each element that signaled deferred care and used the catalog to test verbal assurances. He asked for contractor bids and for escrowed allocation proportional to projected replacement figures. Those steps required sellers to finally address the backlog they had created. Resistance ensued because accountability reduced immediate profit and required confronting long-postponed responsibilities. Ethan's insistence rippled outward. He spoke with peers and urged prospective buyers to demand documented protection and verified condition. He did not aim to halt market function, but to rebalance who bore cost. His refusal highlighted how market language could conceal obligation while celebrating paper value. Mark tried another angle, emphasizing pride of ownership and the freedom to personalize, to renovate on one's own timetable, to build equity through labor. Ethan remained unmoved. Personalization did not replace a collapsed coil or a compromised roof. It did not pay for emergency replacement, and it could not substitute for escrowed protection. Ethan's stance required institutional alignment rather than exhortation. He wanted obligations matched to documented risk before signing any agreement. The negotiation ended without transfer. Ethan walked away with clarity that the path often labeled progress could instead be a route into absorbing other people's deferred decisions. He rejected the role of default fixer and chose preservation of financial agency over the symbolic status of ownership. The sellers moved on to the next prospective buyer, and the cycle continued until someone accepted the transfer of unresolved work. Ethan suspected the pattern would persist until buyer insistence, policy changes, or market correction forced accountability. He accepted that his action alone would not transform practice, but he believed that consistent refusal could create pressure for explicit procedures that protected buyers. In conversations with other prospective buyers, he emphasized documentation, insisted on escrow, and described the consequences of accepting deferred obligation. Some listeners bristled at what they perceived as risk aversion. Others absorbed the warning and recalculated their expectations. Ethan's position was not moralizing, it was pragmatic and protective. He had measured the arithmetic and concluded that immediate repair obligations turned symbolic equity into financial vulnerability. The final refusal left a tension, unresolved between market processes oriented around appearance and the practical needs of people who would live with mechanical failure if it occurred. Ethan closed that chapter refusing to be the absorber of deferred maintenance, refusing to convert appearance into obligation without verified protection, and holding his position against pressure that favored tidy exits over durable care. He left the negotiation knowing the system expected compliance, and he had chosen resistance. The consequence would be determined by who next accepted the transfer of cost, and Ethan resolved not to be the one to pick up the bill for buyer avoidance. He requested precise contractor bids that itemized scope and cost down to the final component, and insisted funds be placed in escrow until certified work was completed. He wanted written warranties transferred in full and liability clauses guaranteeing remediation if hidden failures emerged after transfer. Ethan worked with professionals to translate technical findings into enforceable contractual language and to ensure that escrow schedules matched verified replacement timelines. The proposals he designed paired price correction with secured funds, removing ambiguity about who would pay for replacement when systems failed imminently. Market Times proposed phased work after closing, arguing that scheduling repairs could spread costs, but Ethan argued that post-transfer remediation exposed him to emergency scenarios where sequencing collapsed and costs multiplied. He demanded immediate financial protections rather than optimistic plans offered with no binding guarantee. Some sellers accepted escrowed arrangements that tied funds directly to contractor milestones, and those transactions proceeded with obligations clearly allocated. In other negotiations, sellers resisted, and Ethan walked away rather than accept vague promises. His stance altered the dynamic of conversations. Agents adjusted expectations, and some buyers began to coordinate to insist on similar measures. Ethan shared his checklist with peers and found that collective insistence made sellers more likely to provide verified commitments. He did not expect immediate market transformation, but he recognized that repeated insistence on accountability could change outcomes in individual deals. The practical logic of his approach was simple. Documented protection prevented sudden financial shocks that would erode long-term plans. Ethan understood that refusing to accept deferred maintenance as a buyer's burden required organizational effort and contractual precision, but he accepted that work as necessary for durable ownership. Walking away from offers without protection was not an abdication of ambition, but a defense of financial agency and daily options. Ethan's refusal forced a confrontation with how wealth had been produced and distributed in real estate transactions, exposing a transfer mechanism that preserved profit through postponement of care. The calculus that had once felt inevitable surfaced as a choice made by those with capital and shielded by a market structure that rewarded delay. His negotiation tactics emphasized transparency, enforceability, and matching of price to known condition, rather than faith in future appreciation. Ethan kept his demands narrowly technical and legally precise to avoid moralizing while insisting on fair allocation of risk. His persistence produced concessions in some cases, and when protections were present, he proceeded with confidence. When protections were absent, he declined. This pattern created a small but growing pressure for sellers to document work and for agents to present verified condition rather than polished presentation alone. Ethan did not claim victory. He claimed control over how much risk he would accept. The finality of his refusals made evident a fault. No victory announced. A dangerous quiet settled across offers, and the next buyer to accept would pay brutally without mercy. The screen filled with unread alerts, and the pressure arrived like an accusation that could not be ignored, forcing Sarah Mitchell to face a clash she had not invited and would not be able to ignore. A single choice had widened into a contest over expectation and control, and every message pushed the boundary further. Sarah Mitchell grew up fast, took on responsibility early, and shaped her life around care that often required invisible compromises. Raising Alex Mitchell became the axis around which many decisions turned, creating a closeness that blurred lines between guidance and permission. That closeness had been a comfort and a habit, something practiced until it felt like the air of the household, and Sarah had come to rely on shared decisions and steady input from Alex as a way to include family in the parts of her life that did not belong to anyone else. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. David Mitchell stood beside her in partnership without replacing that bond. He offered support and room, while the central dynamic continued to revolve around Sarah and Alex. The family pattern made certain things simple: Opinions were exchanged freely, preferences carried weight, and involvement from Alex was often accepted as affirmation rather than negotiation. Sarah did not see the pattern as a problem until a single evening made the pattern into a mandate. An outside event required preparation, and Sarah treated it as her own moment, though she invited Alex into the process. They chose clothing together, discussed styling, and the act of choosing became another shared instance that confirmed a familiar rhythm. That rhythm reassured Sarah that independence and connection could coexist, that leaving for a moment did not mean abandoning responsibility. Questions surfaced about her return, and Sarah answered honestly without promising specifics, explaining that she could not guarantee an exact arrival. Alex acknowledged the explanation, and Sarah accepted that acknowledgement as sufficient, believing consent had been given. Sarah left with a sense that the arrangement was understood, that inclusion and a lack of rigid guarantee balanced one another. At the event, Sarah remained attentive to obligations, keeping a device within reach and scanning messages when she could. For most of the time, there was nothing to indicate trouble, only ordinary interaction and moments of enjoyment. The change occurred when the messages on the screen multiplied into a pattern that demanded interpretation rather than simple attention. Missed calls listed as unread, a sequence of messages that conveyed increasing urgency, an incoming alert that shaped the rest of the night into an account waiting to be answered. The content of those messages reframed absence as negligence rather than distance. They presented a narrative in which Sarah had promised more than she had and owed immediate explanation for an access she had not granted. Sarah reviewed what she had communicated and found her words aligned with what she had intended, yet the messages reshaped intention into breach. Alex moved from concern to accusation with language that reduced complexity to a moral claim. Caring, Alex argued, required constant availability, and any choice that removed instant accessibility was a failure of priority. The demand was couched as a right rather than a plea, insisting that the identity of parent superseded other identities, and that Sarah's choices must reflect that hierarchy. The tone of the exchanges made negotiation difficult, as the issue no longer read as simple misunderstanding, but as a test of allegiance. Sarah attempted to restate the original understanding in calm terms, to clarify that no promise had been made, and that her actions had not been in disregard. The responses she received reframed explanation as evasion, converting words into proof of disregard rather than a clarification of fact. David observed the sequence without intervening into the messages themselves, offering presence and restraint as Sarah navigated the escalation. His role in the moments that followed was to anchor rather than to argue, recognizing that the dynamic being tested belonged to the relationship between Sarah and Alex, and that insertion might only entrench positions. Sarah felt the pressure of that reality. She could explain, defend, or appease, but each option would alter the relationship in ways that could not be undone by an immediate fix. The messages carved out a path toward compliance, suggesting that yielding would restore calm, while resistance would deepen distance. That structure turned a personal choice into a dilemma that reached beyond a single evening. When Sarah attempted outreach to repair what had hardened into a standoff, she encountered responses that closed off conversation rather than opened it. Refusal to engage became a statement of power, and silence functioned as leverage. The imposition was subtle yet absolute. Absence became a method of control, leaving Sarah to interpret the boundaries that Alex had drawn. The dynamic revealed an expectation that Sarah remain perpetually available in exchange for the comfort of closeness, an arrangement that disguised its cost until it demanded renegotiation. Sarah found herself reconsidering how many decisions she had ceded to ease, how often she had equated harmony with submission. The household adapted to the new distance with a quiet that felt deliberate. Responsibilities continued, tasks were completed, but the cadence of interaction had changed. Sarah noticed the difference most in the small gestures that once signaled connection. Those gestures receded, replaced by a taut formality that demanded inspection rather than connection. Sarah weighed her options and scanned memory for moments that might have signaled the shift earlier. Occasions when she prioritized availability over self, conversations framed as expectations rather than choices, instances where mutuality had been replaced by default compliance. The pattern emerged not as a single event, but as a braided accumulation of small concessions and amplified dependence. Alex doubled down on interpretive authority, insisting that care was a unilateral standard that did not allow negotiation. Loyalty became measured by immediate response and constant presence, and any deviation from that standard was framed as a moral failing rather than a practical boundary. The rhetoric implied an erosion of personal agency. The more Sarah answered to obligation, the less room she had for her essential choices. The relationship shifted from interdependence toward a system in which one party set rules and the other was expected to follow. Sarah found herself confronting the duality of attachment and autonomy. The bond with Alex had been a source of identity. It had given her meaning and structured her days. Yet, in this new form, it threatened to consume the autonomy that allowed her to choose experiences that were not defined solely by familial caretaking. She felt the pressure of having to reassert a sense of self without invalidating the years of care that had built their connection. The effort required a language careful enough to separate intention from accusation, firm enough to resist a demand framed as moral imperative, and empathetic enough to preserve a relationship that had sustained both of them for years. David listened to her recounting of exchanges, to the pattern that had shifted from mutual to prescriptive. He reinforced the notion that partnership could coexist with personal freedom, that parenting did not require the erasure of self, and that a family's health depended on allowing adults within it to hold roles beyond caretaking. His perspective provided Sarah with a point of reference that contrasted with the narrowing view Alex presented. Still, the decision belonged to Sarah to make and act upon. Support could steady her, but it could not reconfigure the dynamic alone. Sarah attempted to rebuild communication by opening a path that emphasized mutual standards rather than unilateral demands. She proposed boundaries that recognized responsibility while preserving autonomy, definitions that would include contingency plans and shared expectations rather than immediate compliance. Alex met these moves with skepticism framed as a preference for certainty. Any approach that suggested flexibility was interpreted as a way to avoid accountability. The negotiation hardened quickly into a test of wills as much as a discussion of practical needs. The conflict revealed how roles become weaponized when certainty is demanded and autonomy is resented. Alex's insistence on absolute availability created an environment where any independent choice was suspect, and Sarah's insistence on autonomy became the sole strategy against a pressure that threatened to override personal identity. The tension accumulated as each party defended the territory they perceived as essential. Alex defending a secure pattern of dependability, Sarah defending the right to inhabit other spaces without abdication of care. Conversations between them continued to circle without landing on a sustainable arrangement. Attempts to outline a plan for shared responsibility were interpreted through the lens of prior expectation rather than present need. The divide widened not because of a lack of options, but because the framework for evaluating options had shifted from collaborative problem-solving to moral adjudication. Sarah recognized that any solution would have to address that framework itself, to reframe accountability as reciprocal rather than absolute. As the exchanges continued, Sarah confronted the consequences of both paths. Choosing compliance might restore quiet and preserve a sense of safety, but at the cost of dissolving the very autonomy that had given her the capacity to make choices meaningful to herself. Choosing standing ground might preserve agency, but risk a prolonged estrangement that would alter daily life in ways that could not be undone by simple apology. The stakes were not hypothetical, they were structural, mapping the future of a relationship onto a single axis of control. family routines adjusted to the strain as everyone negotiated the new normal. The younger children were away during the period in question, which left the dynamic between Sarah and Alex exposed without the buffer of broader household activity. That absence allowed emotions to crystallize rather than diffuse, concentrating the disagreement into a smaller arena where it could not be easily mediated by ordinary busyness. The contraction magnified the problem and accelerated the need for resolution. Sarah tried different approaches: conciliatory gestures without surrender, clear boundary statements without accusation, offers of compromise that acknowledged both responsibility and independent choice. Each move required careful framing to avoid being interpreted as either capitulation or provocation. The pattern of replies she received, however, often failed to acknowledge the nuance she attempted to create, responding instead with categorical statements that left little room for negotiation. At certain points, Sarah considered surrender not because she agreed with the premises, but because the cost of contest felt too high. But she found that yielding would leave a residue of resentment that could not be reconciled by a return to silence. She understood that peace bought by permission would be fragile, vulnerable to future demands that could escalate with each concession. The calculus of choice weighed immediate calm against long-term erosion, and she found herself unable to accept a solution that traded away her identity for temporary quiet. David continued to stand as an ally but emphasized that the deepest work would involve re-establishing a pattern of exchange that treated both care and independence as essentials. He suggested a conversation that would redefine expectations through shared definitions and agreed responses, but Alex's insistence on absolute certainty made that approach difficult to initiate. The conversation that might have rebalanced the relationship had become itself a symptom of imbalance. The situation reached a point where avoidance was no longer a neutral act, but a statement with consequences. Leaving the field of negotiation would be interpreted as neglect, and engaging without clarity would be interpreted as weakness. Sarah recognized that the path forward would require decisive language and an acceptance that some cost was inevitable. She also perceived that whatever choice she made would shape how trust and availability were measured from that moment on. Sarah stood amid the pressure, aware that a decision was overdue and that either path would leave its mark. The messages had already redefined the terms of their relationship, and the coming choices would not simply restore what was lost. The balance that once allowed closeness to exist without suffocation had been compromised, and the remedy would demand courage rather than compromise alone. The next move would force a division, and the consequence of that division would be immediate and irreversible. The moment the gifts appeared, Megan Brooks felt the line she had drawn with Tyler collapse into something she could no longer ignore. The pile in front of her made it impossible to pretend nothing had shifted between what had been agreed and what had been done. Megan and Tyler had been deliberate about what they wanted for their child, and they had explained to Tyler's mother, Patricia Brooks, that experiences and a few small, specific items were the only acceptable choices. They had assembled a short wish list with items they would actually use, and that fit their limited space, and Patricia had asked for that list herself. Megan had watched accumulation become pressure, watched well-intended gifts turn into stress, and she refused to let the pattern repeat. Tyler had supported the plan. He had helped choose the items and had told Megan his mother appreciated the guidance. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. Patricia sent images of what she had bought, and nothing matched. The wish list, oversized boxes, a ride-on car, a boxed play kitchen, a keyboard, a tablet made for children that contradicted the rules they set about screens, stacks of books that would overwhelm storage. Megan absorbed the details with a calm that carried weight. The scale of the purchases suggested space and habits she and Tyler did not have and did not want to create. She told Tyler the items would remain with Patricia and that they would not be bringing them home, stating the boundary without spectacle or pleading. Tyler lingered on the images longer than Megan did, caught between understanding his mother's excitement and seeing the precedent accepting the items would set. He felt the pressure of two loyalties, the person who raised him and the family he was building with Megan. Patricia believed physical gifts were proof of care. Her intent had been to show effort and provide joy, and her message about being on a naughty list had been meant as playful rather than defiant. For Megan, that playful tone collapsed into dismissal. The choice to ignore the list signaled a deeper disregard for the limits they had tried to set. Megan did not escalate to accusation. She repeated the decision and held the line, because she had learned that retreat to avoid discomfort only allowed future erosion. Tyler began to consider compromises that would not undercut the principle, suggesting visits where certain items could be used at Patricia's place, proposing a rotation that kept oversized toys out of their home, offering to accept small items from the wish list instead. Each proposal shifted responsibility without changing the core fact that Patricia had purchased items outside the agreed guidance, and Megan declined solutions that masked the underlying issue. Patricia framed her purchases as labor and love, underscoring the hours she spent selecting items and the thought she believed each selection reflected. Megan acknowledged effort without equating effort to permission, making clear that listening to agreed limits mattered more than visible gestures. The conflict moved from objects to expectations. Who would define acceptable choices for the child, and how would those definitions be enforced? Tyler found the language to relay Megan's position to his mother and realized softened words sometimes became loopholes. He understood that phrasing would determine whether the boundary would hold. Patricia expected gratitude and confirmation, surprised that her actions met refusal, and responded with messages that tried to reframe the purchases as a misunderstanding of intent. Megan resisted that reframing. The list had been practical and specific on purpose, and deviation from it suggested priorities that did not align. She thought about the wish list items and why they fit: cards for a Yodo player, toddler headphones for that device, a couple of sports shirts, 2 books, a small water table sized for their balcony, and a toy trash truck, choices that matched routines and space. The images of oversized packages represented disregard rather than generosity in practice, and that distinction hardened Megan's resolve. Tyler's internal conflict deepened as he imagined the trade-offs: immediate ease by accepting items versus a pattern of boundaries that dissolved under pressure. He weighed the short-term relief of appeasing Patricia against the long-term cost of teaching their child that persistence could override a clear request. Patricia, when challenged, alternated between hurt and insistence. That good intentions should prevail, asserting that the act of purchasing demonstrated involvement, worthy of welcome. Megan did not deny Patricia's affection, but refused to accept that affection justified ignoring what they had set as a household standard. Tyler began to understand that avoiding the conflict would not protect anyone. It would only postpone a larger rupture that could come from accumulating exceptions. He attempted to broker terms that preserved the boundary while offering Patricia connection, shared activities, contributions to membership fees, and specifically chosen small items from the original list. Patricia heard offers as partial concessions and pushed back, insisting that physical gifts were her language of participation. Megan recognized the difference in languages and proposed ways. Patricia could contribute that honored the wish list without overturning the plan. Those proposals did not erase Patricia's belief that her purchases deserved acceptance as proof of care, and her disappointment intensified because immediate acknowledgement did not follow. Tyler felt the strain of being the interpreter between two perspectives, and saw that neutrality was impossible. Choosing meant making a visible alignment in front of the people he loved. He understood that yielding would be read as undermining Megan, while refusing would be read as rejecting his mother. Neither felt free of cost. Megan's focus remained on outcomes for the child. consistency in boundaries, predictability in the home, and avoiding a lesson that desires could be advanced by persistence or by interpreting goodwill as latitude. She refused compromise that merely redistributed the problem. Keeping items at a relative's place did not solve the core issue of respect for decided limits. Patricia questioned whether exclusion from choices equaled exclusion from the child's life, and Megan pushed back, clarifying that inclusion could arrive through guided contributions aligned with their needs. Tyler sought phrases that expressed appreciation for Patricia's intention while underscoring the necessity of honoring the agreed plan. He told Patricia that the refusal did not reflect lack of love, but a decision about how care would be expressed in the child's environment. Patricia's reaction ranged from wounded to incredulous. She struggled with a reality where contribution did not equal permission. Megan's refusal required her to accept discomfort. She articulated the consequence plainly. Accepting items would make every future limit negotiable under emotional pressure. Tyler, confronting his role, realized leadership would mean aligning with the household's agreed values, even if doing so created immediate strain with his family of origin. He also recognized that avoiding this confrontation might save feelings at first and cost much more, because expectations would harden into assumptions. Patricia's insistence grew into a debate about agency. Who decides what is best for a child, and how is authority negotiated among multiple adults who care deeply? Megan considered the cumulative past of small concessions and the way each concession had altered future negotiations. She had learned that consistency was the only form of protection that prevented boundary erosion into habit. Tyler recognized that being torn between two people he loved required a decision that would define their household norms. Patricia saw the decision as a rejection of her way of contributing and interpreted the refusal as a personal rebuke. Megan did not seek to rebuke. She sought alignment with the values that determined their daily choices. Tyler attempted to bridge the gap by offering specific alternatives matched to the wish list while making clear that the large items could not move into their home. Patricia alternately accepted and rejected those alternatives, sometimes suggesting compromises that would still place items within reach, which Megan rejected. The negotiation reached a point where no small concession would close the gap. The difference was fundamental to how decisions affecting their child would be made. Megan's resolve remained steady. She would not transport items that contradicted the plan she and Tyler had built. Tyler made the choice to stand publicly with Megan's position, explaining to Patricia that their household would not accept the oversized gifts. Patricia received that decision with a mixture of disbelief and hurt, and the emotional cost of the refusal became visible in messages that shifted between indignation and plie. Megan offered acknowledgement of care and effort without reversing the decision. She explained that honoring the wish list allowed Patricia to contribute meaningfully without undermining their boundaries. Tyler reiterated the practical alternatives and reminded Patricia that involvement could take many forms that aligned with their plan. Patricia, faced with a clear refusal, chose to keep the items rather than force them into a home where they would contradict the rules. The presence of the boxes in the images remained a symbol of the rupture in expectations, and Patricia's choice to retain them left the immediate physical issue resolved but the relational issue unsettled. Megan accepted the loneliness that sometimes accompanies setting limits. She believed the long-term message to her child was worth the short-term strain. Tyler dealt with the immediate fallout by communicating compassion to his mother while reinforcing the household decision. Patricia, processing the refusal, began to consider alternative ways to participate that did not center on physical gifts imposed on others. The exchange altered patterns that had assumed pliability. It clarified that consent and agreement would guide choices within the family they were forming. Megan did not celebrate victory. She continued to shape the environment they controlled and to make choices consistent with the values that guided them. Tyler adjusted to the reality that defending a boundary could create friction with loved ones and accepted that friction as a cost of clarity. Patricia faced the reality that intention without alignment could cause harm, and she began to navigate how to express care within the limits set. The decision not to bring the oversized items home became a clear precedent. Agreed limits would be honored, and deviation would not be rewarded by acceptance. Each person left the exchange with a new understanding of how their actions intersected with other people's needs, and the dynamic between them had shifted into a new pattern of negotiation. Megan's refusal did not erase affection, it redefined the terms of participation in the child's life. Tyler learned that alignment in partnership sometimes required immediate discomfort to prevent more profound conflict from arising. Patricia adjusted her approach, considering contributions that matched the wish list or that facilitated shared experiences without imposing physical clutter. The items remained where they were, and the principle held. The household's boundaries stayed intact because someone had chosen clarity over ease. The consequence of that choice extended beyond the immediate exchange, marking how future decisions would be approached and who would have authority to shape their shared environment. No apology smoothed the tension into oblivion, and no hasty compromise erased the lesson about consent in giving and receiving. The line that Megan drew held, and the shape of their family's choices had changed with it, leaving a quiet, undeniable weight that would influence how they navigated what came next. The demand arrived like an incision, precise and impossible to ignore, and it unstitched everything Natalie Foster had been trying to hold together. Natalie had survived the crash that took Kevin Moore, and the ring he gave her before that event became the single constant she would not relinquish. Kevin chose a non-traditional pair of stones, garnet and emerald, selected with Natalie's name and taste in mind, an object that connected two people in a way no other object could. Natalie wore it on her right hand as a deliberate choice, a visible mark she kept with intention, and the presence of that small band carried decisions, conversations, and a sharp private history that Natalie guarded without apology. Grief did not simplify itself for Natalie. It layered. She found a place where the kind of loss she carried was not questioned, a group where individuals who had been changed in different ways recognized the same quiet fractures. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. That was where she met Aaron Blake. Aaron had his own possession of memory, his late wife's name, a plain band he kept, a sincerity that did not require explanation. Natalie and Aaron connected by acknowledging what they had been given and what they had not been allowed to finish. Aaron never asked Natalie to remove the ring. He accepted its presence because his own band had never been an obstacle to respect. Their relationship grew from that acceptance and from an understanding that what they carried would coexist with what they were building together. Natalie kept contact with Kevin's family in a way that felt natural to her. She did not sever ties because erased connections felt wrong. Diane Moore, Kevin's mother, maintained regular lines of contact with Natalie under the pretense of shared memory and mutual care. Diane spoke often about Kevin in ways that read as both consolation and claim. For a long time, the interactions stayed within the boundaries Natalie expected. Shared recollections, updates about those who had known Kevin, messages that felt like mutual maintenance of a common loss. The ring remained visible on Natalie's right hand throughout these exchanges and carried its own simple truth. It belonged to Natalie because Kevin and she had selected it together. Then Diane shifted. The tone in her messages acquired a firmness Natalie had not anticipated. Diane wrote about family, about lineage, about the need to preserve physical reminders for relatives. Natalie read the words carefully, aware of the treacherous way grief could reframe what was shared into what was claimed. Diane asked for the ring back. She framed the request as preservation. She described it as a final purchase by Kevin that ought to remain with his bloodline. Natalie understood the vocabulary of loss enough to detect its edges. Diane had made a demand. Natalie answered that the ring had never been an heirloom. She explained plainly that she and Kevin had chosen it together and that Kevin had saved for it. She said it remained hers. Diane answered with insistence. She said the ring had become part of the family's possessions by virtue of it being the last major thing Kevin purchased. Her language turned the ring into proof of lineage rather than proof of relationship. Natalie's refusal to hand it over shifted the conversation from gentle remembrance into contested property. Natalie disconnected the call before Diane could escalate her tone. She stopped returning messages that carried the shade of entitlement. Natalie did not want to escalate, but every unanswered message produced new ones that broadened the argument. Diane sent notes with phrases that hinted at obligation. Relatives offered opinions that supported Diane's claim. Some relatives framed Natalie's refusal as a disrespect to Kevin's memory. Others couched their words in sympathy for Diane's loss and presented resignation as the morally right path. Natalie read each message and felt the pressure of interpretation pressing inward, as though the ring's meaning were being redefined by people who had not been the ones to choose it. Aaron watched Natalie navigate the incoming messages with restraint. He offered firm support without insisting on aggressive responses. He emphasized the right. Natalie had to hold what Kevin had given her and pointed to the core of the matter: consent. Aaron believed Natalie's possession of the ring was her right because it resulted from a mutual decision between two people now separated by circumstance. His voice in her life was steady. His presence allowed Natalie to articulate a boundary she had not realized she needed to defend so explicitly. Natalie turned to her parents for counsel. Her mother, Susan Foster, urged empathy. She used language rooted in pain. Diane had lost a son and wanted something tangible that belonged to him. Her mother's comments formed a pressure Natalie recognized as compassion, not as a verdict. Her father, Thomas Foster, spoke differently. He described ownership and autonomy, arguing that a gift exchanged between two people should not be reclaimed by a third. Natalie absorbed both perspectives and felt the divide between care and agency widen. She accepted her parents' intentions without surrendering the ring. As exchanges multiplied, Natalie encountered public opinion from within Kevin's extended circle. A few acquaintances suggested that Natalie relinquish the ring to avoid conflict. Others argued that she had a right to keep it, that a personal object chosen by two partners should not be appropriated by a family simply because grief demanded a visible token. Natalie found herself at the center of contradictory counsel. Compassion pressed her in one direction, while principles of ownership and individual agency pushed her in another. She decided to maintain possession and to make that choice public in how she wore the ring and how she answered messages. Diane did not accept silence as final. She contacted multiple family members and allies and sought to gather support for her claim. Diane's arguments centered around continuity. She positioned the ring as something that connected Kevin to relatives who outlived him and framed Natalie as a temporary carrier rather than a rightful owner. Natalie felt the sting of that framing because it suggested her role was conditional. Those words implied that her right to remember would expire once a new partner entered her life. That interpretation struck at the heart of what kept Natalie steadied, the ability to hold memory without permission. The conflict bled into Natalie's relationship with Aaron in ways that required negotiation. Aaron never told Natalie to hand the ring over, but he also recognized the social cost of prolonged conflict. He asked what Natalie needed. Natalie asked for space to make the decision on her own terms. Aaron agreed, offering practical support and emotional steadiness. He walked beside her as the controversy expanded, knowing the consequence of each unanswered message, each deflected call. They set boundaries together. They practiced the quiet refusal to engage when the conversation moved from remembrance to claim. Natalie wrestled with doubts. She considered how relinquishing the ring might ease discomfort for others, and whether that concession could be a kindness. She imagined the ring placed in a relative's possession, cataloged and stored, invoked at family gatherings as proof of connection. But she also pictured giving up an object that represented a mutual decision with Kevin, an object whose meaning was entwined with their choices. Natalie concluded that concessions would not erase Diane's grief, and that relinquishment would not return what Diane wanted most: Kevin himself. Natalie saw friends and acquaintances split between empathy and admonition. Some asked whether keeping the ring while in a new relationship was disrespectful. Natalie refused the premise that remembrance and new affection were mutually exclusive. She wore the ring not as a barrier, but as a testament to layered loyalties. It signaled the fact that she had loved and that she was capable of loving again without erasing what had come before. That argument did not persuade Diane. Diane insisted on a single narrative: family possession. As the conflict mounted, Diane intensified her requests, sent sharper messages, and brought more relatives into the discussion. Natalie received letters and texts that appealed to sentiment and to obligation. One relative asked Natalie bluntly whether she believed the ring's stones had lost their value because someone else had entered her life. Natalie considered the question and responded privately that value was not transferable in that way. She explained that value attached to intention and mutual choice, not to lineage. Those answers did not satisfy the relatives who had been led to believe that objects could substitute for presence. Natalie's refusal hardened into a deliberate stance. She stopped opening messages that asked for the ring. She replied only when necessary and with concise statements that repeated the same core. The ring had been chosen with Kevin and remained a possession Natalie intended to keep. She did not phrase her replies as confrontational. She phrased them as declarations of agency. Each succinct response became a boundary. Each unanswered outreach from Diane and her allies became a test of how much control grief could exert over other people's lives. Those tests escalated into moments that required public explanation. Natalie faced acquaintances who expected reconciliation by way of concession. She encountered family members with questions that aimed to simplify a complex relationship into a binary decision. Natalie remained firm. She did not grant interviews or dramatic public apologies. Instead, she kept the ring visible and kept her responses measured. Her discipline surprised some and angered others, but it affirmed a clarity. Natalie would not surrender what had been given by consent to placate someone else's loss. Aaron remained a consistent presence through the strain. He did not post messages or rally alleys. He supported Natalie quietly, offered a hand when the pressure felt heavy, and reminded her that her decisions were permitted by her own agency. Aaron's restraint mattered because it underscored that the conflict was not about his presence, but about Natalie's right to hold what she had a legitimate claim to. He did not fight Diane on Natalie's behalf. He defended Natalie by reinforcing her autonomy at each necessary point and by refusing to let the dispute define their relationship. Natalie's mother continued to advocate for empathy. She urged Natalie to consider whether relinquishing the ring would ease an already painful situation. Natalie acknowledged her mother's plea, loved her mother's desire for harmony, but did not equate empathy with acquiescence. Her father reiterated that choice mattered above all. He reminded Natalie that gifts exchanged in love were not automatically subject to reclamation. Those parental voices existed as both counsel and pressure. Natalie considered them and kept hold of the ring. The exchanges arranged themselves into a private-public conflict, a contested object on which multiple people projected different expectations. Natalie remained the holder of the ring and the narrator of its meaning, refusing to allow its interpretation to be co-opted by others. Diane's insistence continued to ripple through Kevin's relatives until even acquaintances posed questions that suggested Natalie's decision required explanation. Natalie answered when necessary but did not explain beyond the boundary she had set. The ring belonged to her and to the decision she and Kevin had made. As messages from Diane increased, Natalie recognized a different pattern emerge. The conflict had shifted away from property and into power. Diane's demands became not simply about reclaiming an object, but about asserting control over how Kevin's absence would be memorialized. That realization changed the stakes. Natalie's retention of the ring no longer meant merely holding a piece of jewelry. It meant resisting a claim that Natalie's memory and autonomy were subordinate to another person's grief. Natalie prepared mentally for the possibility of escalation. She understood that the next move could be public and could force choices that would not only test boundaries, but also reveal who among Kevin's circle would insist on possession rather than recognition. Natalie braced for confrontation that might require stronger defenses than words, and she resolved that surrendering the ring under pressure would be conceding to a notion of grief that replaced mutual decision with familial decree. The dispute had corroded ordinary interactions and exposed the brittle places where memory and ownership met. Diane pushed. Relatives aligned. Natalie stood her ground with a ring on her hand that had been chosen for her, and Aaron remained at her side without trying to overpower the conflict. The ring glinted with the same stones and the same intent, and what remained uncertain was whether Natalie's refusal would force a change in the circle that sought to recast her past as a possession available for reclamation. The next response would determine whether control or choice prevailed, and Natalie tightened her grip on what Kevin had given her, unwilling to relinquish it to anyone who believed grief entitled them to rewrite what had been freely given. The instant Allison Reed set a boundary, the fragile balance that had been held together by politeness and avoidance came apart in a single sharp motion. What she intended as protection for her plans became a fault line that forced everything private into public view, and the consequences unfolded faster than anyone expected. Allison had asked her sister Brooke Reed to take a central role in the wedding because she believed that inclusion might help keep them close. Brooke agreed and stepped into the role with a level of attention that felt earnest at first, and then unnerving. Brooke carried a loss that had reshaped how she responded to certain people and certain moments, and that loss began to move through the planning like an uninvited shadow. Allison wanted a supportive presence at her side, not a director of other people's comfort, and she tried to hold both aims at once, to be patient and to keep her day theirs as well. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. Brooke's life before the engagement had been fractured in ways Allison had not fully understood. Brooke's relationship with Daniel Moore had ended under a cloud, and Brooke had told everyone the breakup was a consequence of the loss she had suffered. When Allison later spoke with Melissa Grant, Brooke's closest friend, a different version surfaced. Brooke had been involved with another partner while she was with Daniel. When Daniel confronted Brooke about it, Brooke folded the grief into the explanation until confusion replaced clarity. Allison carried this information carefully and chose not to expose it, believing confrontation would only deepen the harm she wanted to avoid. At an event meant to celebrate Allison, the attention shifted away from the couple when Brooke's reaction to an infant reached a level that pulled everyone in. Brooke's distress became the center of the gathering, and the group moved to tend to her. Allison stayed nearby, offering comfort, even as the moment that should have been about her was absorbed. She allowed the grace, thinking empathy could coexist with celebration, but the pattern continued. After that, anything tied to Allison's plan seemed to touch the raw place Brooke carried. A trip to a flower shop ended with Brooke collapsing beside arrangements because of a blue bouquet Allison had chosen. Brooke insisted the color meant something lost and could not be ignored. During dress shopping, Brooke chose a maternity-style sample and wanted to try it on to imagine what might have been. She adjusted the fabric against herself in a way that made Allison step away. Allison suggested counseling, offered to go with her, approached each moment with care, and Brooke insisted that her actions were within the scope of grief. Brooke took responsibility for organizing a gathering with friends, and Allison accepted the help with relief. The relief vanished when Allison learned Brooke had circulated a set of rules without consultation, topics to avoid, a ban on certain colors, and behavior restrictions that prioritized Brooke's comfort over the guests' participation. Allison addressed the list gently, insisting decisions affecting everyone needed discussion, and Brooke nodded while continuing to act independently. When Rachel Collins, one of Allison's closest friends and a bridesmaid, shared she was expecting, the circle tightened. Rachel's news reached Brooke quickly, and Brooke reached back in a private call, suggesting Rachel refrain from attending, because Brooke could not maintain her own peace if she was surrounded by reminders. Brooke told Rachel she needed space and implied the request was in everyone's best interest. Rachel, stunned and uncertain, did not make the decision for Allison. Allison learned about the call through other messages that arrived like a wave. Anger replaced the patience she had been practicing. Brooke had made a choice about attendance without conferring with Allison, and Allison confronted her. She accused Brooke of weaponizing her loss to dictate other people's presence. She set a boundary she hoped would be enough. One more demand or one more public reference to the loss at any wedding-related event, and Brooke would be removed from her role. The line was explicit and not negotiable. Brooke reacted by reframing what had happened. She told friends and family that Allison had cast her out over grief, that Allison had punished her for being unable to move past what she had suffered. Messages began circulating that painted Allison as a person who would discard her sister over sorrow. People Allison relied on reached out with shock and reproach. They had heard Brooke's version first, feeling attacked and desperate to correct the impression forming in private conversations and social threads. Allison told a limited factual account to several friends. She explained that Brooke's relationship with Daniel had not ended solely because of grief. She said Brooke had been involved with someone else while they were together. Allison did not add detail beyond that, but once the information moved, it took on momentum. People repeated it, questioned motives, and picked sides. The circle split into camps. Some defended Allison's decision to enforce limits and maintain a plan she had envisioned for herself. Others sided with Brooke, who framed herself as wounded and in need of protection. Friendships that had been steady shifted into uncertainty. People who had offered support to one sister found themselves weighing loyalty against their own discomfort. The family's private calculus was exposed to judgment in messages, calls, and small clusters of conversation, and those clusters grew into a pattern of alignment where personal alliances determined reception more than facts. Allison replayed every interaction to locate where compassion had become a liability, where patience had allowed control to quietly gather. She questioned whether she had been too lenient or whether she had enabled behavior that crossed others' boundaries. Brooke, for her part, held tight to the narrative that the loss justified broader allowances. To her, ordinary expectations seemed unfair against the weight she carried. Each of them believed the other should move, and neither did. New incidents accumulated like notes that never aligned. At another gathering, Brooke refused to wear a color Allison had requested for the group, and argued that the choice would violate her ability to attend. On the phone, Brooke explained that seeing particular symbols or colors would become an immersion in loss from which she could not extract herself. Allison responded that her own celebration could not be recalibrated to avoid every possible source of pain for one person. The rupture widened when Brooke told people Allison had removed her without cause, and Allison told people Brooke had imposed rules and made decisions without consent. Outside the circle, opinions hardened. Some of Allison's friends privately said she overreacted and that grief warranted more accommodation. Others said she was right to protect her plans, and that setting a firm limit was not a betrayal. Brooke gathered sympathy. Allison gathered supporters who believed boundaries were necessary. The conversation inside the family moved from specifics to a larger argument about responsibility, and the core facts became blunted by interpretation. at a family meeting called by a relative. Hoping to realign the group, both positions echoed without resolution. Brooke repeated that she had been wounded and needed the group to bend. Allison repeated the breach, a request made to someone else, personal rules enacted without consent, and a crossing of obligations that had been assumed when roles were accepted. No one reconciled. Instead, the meeting clarified how far apart the two accounts had become. Allison felt as if she were balancing on a ledge built from small seconds of regret and necessity. She understood how someone could call what she did unforgiving, but she also recognized that her silence had allowed decisions that impacted others to be made unilaterally. Brooke's insistence that grief exempted her from the social contracts of participation had a logic of its own, but it collided with Allison's expectation that roles come with responsibility. Conversations with mutual friends took on a new tone. Some sought to mediate and asked for small accommodations. Others withdrew, unwilling to be pressed into choosing. Messages arrived that were raw and brief: support, anger, confusion. Rumors threaded through those messages, each iteration carrying less context and more conviction. Allison tried to rebuild the path forward. She issued an ultimatum once and then another, always hoping for an acknowledgement that would ease the strain. Brooke countered with accounts that framed Allison as the aggressor, and the two narratives pushed further apart. Each new exchange hardened the positions that once might have softened with a single honest admission. In private moments, both sisters considered what had been lost beyond the immediate arguments. Allison thought about how she had underestimated the impact unresolved pain could have on a shared plan. Brooke considered how her actions had affected people she cared for. Neither reached the other's conclusion. Instead, they retreated into arguments anchored by their own perspective. Small items that had once been simple shared preferences became symbols in the dispute. A flower color, a dress choice, an instruction about conversation topics. Each became evidence in a debate about what behavior was acceptable under the weight of personal grief. The lines were no longer about taste, but about control, and every minor choice acquired a significance that neither sister had imagined when Allison first extended the invitation to stand beside her. Outside, observers began to treat the conflict like a puzzle they could solve by assigning blame, but blame only shifted the burden. Some people labeled Allison as harsh and uncompromising. Others labeled Brooke as manipulative and entitled to special consideration because of her loss. The labels did not create resolution. They created factions that insulated people from acknowledging the complexity of both position and pain. Allison's attempts at containment failed because containment required cooperation she could no longer assume. She imposed the removal of a role to protect the event and her own sanity, and in doing so, she set a boundary that invited retaliation. Brooke pushed back by reframing omissions and conversations, and the community that had once gathered in neutral support found itself aligning according to personal histories and sympathies. The friction had consequences beyond the two sisters. Mutual friends navigated invitations with care or anxiety. Family events were rearranged to avoid confrontation or to allow cooling, and those rearrangements signaled that the rupture was not temporary. The social fabric around them altered every time someone chose a side or offered a conditional olive branch. Allison found herself explaining decisions to people who had not been in the middle of it, answering questions about fairness and compassion. She admitted to friends that her reaction had been sharp, but she also explained that she had been pushed past the point where compromises felt safe. Brooke, for her part, articulated a claim that loss required latitude that ordinary expectations could not provide. Neither argument produced agreement. At a point when both sides expected movement from the other, neither moved. Words hardened into positions, and positions hardened into a pattern that resisted repair. Invitations were edited, replies were withheld, and conversations stopped where they once might have continued. The space that had once felt like a network of mutual obligations tightened into a battleground where every decision carried extra weight. Allison held to the boundary she had drawn, not as triumph, but as defense. Brooke clung to her narrative of woundedness, not as manipulation, but as truth. Both believed they were in the right, and both believed the other had failed first. The collision between those convictions left little room for compromise. Messages continued to pass between mutual friends and family, each one carrying fragments that confirmed bias. People who had once been neutral found themselves making small bets on which sister would relent. The result was a social landscape scarred by alignment, and the sisters occupied opposite edges of that terrain, calling across a canyon that grew deeper with every explanation offered and every charge denied. Allison remained on the side where she had drawn the line, watching the effects radiate outward and inward, aware that some relationships might never return to their previous form. Brooke remained on the side where she had demanded protection, convinced that retreat would mean erasure of what she had lost. Between them, the fracture held and no bridge had been built. Each consequence fed into the next, and the final shape of the rupture was not a single event, but a series of choices that compounded until repair required a concession. Neither sister seemed ready to make. The removal of a role had revealed a deeper breaking, and the community around them could only bear witness as alliances hardened and explanations circulated without resolution. Allison Reed kept the boundary in place, and the silence that settled around it carried the weight of decisions that could not be undone with words alone. The space between her and Brooke tightened like a held breath, and every shared connection that had once promised refuge became another test of whether the bond could be salvaged or whether the break would hold its ground forever. Thanks for watching Story Frame. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more updates. See you in the next video.